is. Sorry I'm late, everybody.
Pinya, there you are. All right. I don't see any questions in the chat, which usually starts us off. So
A new record, no questions at all. What are we going to do for
Oh,
time?
hey, I'll start. This is Carol. So
Cool.
the Twitterverse is all a Twitter about the Middle East, specifically Israel and Iran. Do you have any insight as to what is going on over there?
Well,
Here, just one.
we've seen a couple of things just in the most recent days. As I
As
mentioned during the webinar, Trump admitted publicly, just in the last day or so, how disappointed he is in the lack of progress in the negotiations between the US and Iran, which really shouldn't be surprising because despite the US's efforts to finesse the question, ultimately it comes down to the fact that the United States and its allies don't want Iran to enrich uranium, and Iran wants to enrich uranium, and they haven't found a way to square that circle, nor do I think they will. At the same time, Trump has told Netanyahu on a number of occasions, most recently just in a phone call on Monday, that the possibility of an Israeli aerial attack on Iran's nuclear facilities would be very damaging to the conversations and to the negotiations. Netanyahu doesn't like this because he recognizes that as a result of the Israeli aerial attacks last fall, that Iran is uniquely and temporarily vulnerable to an outside attack. Netanyahu also recognizes that Israel doesn't possess the capability without US help to completely or almost completely destroy the Iranians' nuclear program. But at least as of right now, Trump has been able to keep Netanyahu at bay. But as the negotiations between the US and Iran worsen, I don't know if that can hold. The other thing to keep in mind, as many of you know, is Netanyahu's position in terms of Israeli domestic politics is extremely precarious. Two of the ultra-religious parties have indicated they will leave his coalition, and if they do, he'll no longer be able to maintain a majority in the Knesset. So it's entirely possible that Netanyahu would see a more aggressive approach to Iran as a way of uniting Israel behind him at a time when his time in the prime minister's office might be increasingly vulnerable. So lots of moving parts, lots of possible clues. All in all, Carol, no idea.
Thank you so much, Dan. All right, I saw Roger's hand go up. If you want to go for it.
How do you
What
everybody?
time do you want your dinner? I would have it now, it would be great.
And mute us.
Roger, you're up,
All right, Roger, you are up.
but you're on mute.
Okay, try
There we
that.
go.
How's that?
Much better.
Okay. My question, I'm not in a university environment here where we are, but I'm curious about, is Trump using anti-Semitism as just a foil to defund universities? And if so, is his approach of anti-Semitism actually increasing anti-Semitism?
It's a great question. I actually gave a talk last night at the LA Jewish Federation, and we had a pretty extended conversation on this very topic. And so two really good questions, Roger. The first is it's very clear that whether you happen to be a Trump supporter or opponent, that he and his administration do see an effort to crack down on anti-Semitism. And to be fair to him, a more aggressive effort to crack down on anti-Semitism on college campuses than we saw from his predecessors. But if in addition to that crackdown, if he's using that as an excuse in order to take other more sweeping action, and the answer is certainly yes. There's no question whatsoever that even though while many of us believe that our campus communities deserve a more aggressive approach in terms of confronting anti-Semitism, that in addition to that the administration is using that issue for other unrelated purposes. The second question is an even more interesting, and it's a more difficult one. I've not seen significant evidence of a rise in anti-Semitism in the immediate aftermath of these Trump administration declarations. But I am greatly concerned, and many people I know and respect are greatly concerned, that if the administration does move forward on withholding funds and taking other types of actions that will be detrimental to a university's operation, that will at that time result in a marked increase in anti-Semitism. In other words, our science labs got defunded, and it's all the fault of those Jews, who provoked Trump into doing this. So, one, it certainly is something that he's using to move forward with a much broader agenda. And second, if he does it, I think the level of intolerance that we saw immediately after October 7th, 2023, will return and then some.
Thanks for your answer, Dan.
Of course.
I do want to jump over to a question in the chat if we can. And Ellen, if you want to come unmute and ask your question.
Okay. I think it was Jeff actually, but
Oh,
I'm
good point,
Ellen's
Jeff.
computer. We couldn't get in on my computer. It asked me for a password and froze me out. We just returned from our annual teaching trip to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I was on the faculty of the second oldest university going back to 1955. Last year, I was surprised with some of the positive comments about Trump, and people thought that he was going to be good for Africa. I didn't think so. And this year, I was struck by, and there was a lot of criticism of the Chinese, who are now taking control of the minerals industry and really are all over the place. Our plane on Ethiopian Airlines was probably at least a third, if not half, Chinese coming back from leave. This year, the talk was in the university community how much more trustworthy China was than the United States in terms of ally to the U.S. development. And part of that is the crackdown on it's become very almost impossible for people who've had visas many times to the United States to get appointments to apply for a visa. People have been refused going to weddings, family events, things like that, where they've been to the U.S. 15 times before. And they've had to go to Madagascar to get a visa interview and things. I thought that was, someone asked about the reputation damage that Trump has caused to the U.S., and I was struck by how widespread there had been a turn in educated people from last year's experience.
Bob, I think you raised several good points, and I think one that I'll address is longer term. One is more immediate, more Trump specific. As I know most of you know, for many years, the Chinese government has invested significant amounts of money in the developing world, in Africa, in Latin America, and other parts of Asia, in the Middle East, the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, in which they spend large amounts of money on massive construction and infrastructure projects designed to benefit those countries. That effort is obviously designed to increase goodwill between China and the people of these countries, the so-called soft power that Joseph Nye and Graham Allison have talked about at Harvard for many years. That said, on one hand, China's paid a lot more attention to these countries than the US has. On the other hand, because their loans are on such onerous terms, they often end up engendering just as much ill will as goodwill, sometimes even more. In other words, they invest in these projects, send over large numbers of Chinese workers to build them, not employing any of the local populace. And then when the loans come due, adopt a sort of a Tony Soprano approach to cracking down on the borrowers who aren't able to pay the money back. So Belt and Road did help them develop some relationships, but it's also caused a lot of bad feelings also, which I think is reflected in what you may have heard
Thought they were doing.
as recently as last year. Trump is not, of course, investing anymore in these countries in Africa or elsewhere than his predecessors did. But as we all know, between the dramatic diminishment of USAID and the very noticeable cutbacks in State Department staffing around the world, between the lack of staff to process these visa requests, and the increasing administrative obstacles that have been erected, have caused real frustrations in countries where, like you said, people who've come to this country for short-term visits many, many times before are now having a much more difficult time doing so. So long-term, the Chinese government probably created opportunities for us that neither Trump or his predecessors took advantage of. And in the short run, by shrinking the US's foreign footprint, by the way, in accordance with the majority of US public opinion, I think that more than anything, Bob, reflects what you've seen on your most recent visit. So we could spend a full hour on the regular webinar just on your question. But at least for now, we'll settle for a few minutes. So I'm glad you raised it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. The next hand I see up is Robert.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the call. Dan, piggybacking on your point with regard to workforce and availability of folks who may be getting deported, it's a two-part question, really. One on the likelihood, and two on if that should happen, and I'll tell you what I'm talking about momentarily. What would be the reaction? Would it be a positive or negative, and for whose purpose? Of something that I think happened on one day, which was a day without immigrants earlier this year. If there were to be a much more generalized, a little bit longer, maybe a week, general strike of immigrants just walking off every imaginable job that they do, would that how would that resonate with the American population? Would they understand the importance of immigrants to us? Would they resent it all? Would it work to Trump's benefit, against him? And do you think that could actually happen?
So, Robert, as you may know, and I know that some of our other group here probably do remember, there's actually a movie that came out in the 1990s along these lines.
Are you saying I'm old?
I'm sorry?
Are you saying I'm old?
No, it's far before your time. Ask your father about that.
There you go.
Okay. Movie in the 1990s called A Day Without Mexicans. And that was the premise. It's not that they went on strike, but the idea through some science fiction-y way is this mist came off the Pacific Ocean into Los Angeles. And when the mist receded, there were no immigrants left in the region, having just the impact that you were talking about. Great premise, lousy movie. So if you read the Wikipedia entry, you've probably gotten all you need. But what I would say is this. I think we are currently living in such a polarized and such a divided environment that I don't think it would have the persuasive impact that it might have a generation ago. I think at this point, it would simply harden convictions on both sides. Half of the country lamenting their absence and the difficulties it caused in all the sectors I was talking about, and half who would instead turn them into scapegoats for causing such disruption. So it's a fascinating idea. From a more practical standpoint, I'm not sure that I would either have the courage or want to have the courage to tell someone struggling to feed their family that they should voluntarily forego work in order to make a political point. But it's a fascinating concept. And I'd say either the movie or the Wikipedia entry is worth either 2 hours or 2 minutes of your time.
Okay.
Thank you. And then I see Bob's hand up next.
Thank you very much. Dan, many of my students at Santa Monica Emeritus College are completely frustrated about the current situation. And they say, what can we do about it? And I said, well, there are demonstrations this weekend. And they said, well, some of us are too old to go. Then I say, well, there's an election in 2026, and that's a critical election. And many of them say that's too long to wait. So my question to you, Dan, is what should people be doing now if they're completely frustrated in order to make them feel better about the situation?
Let's say the most important thing to do, and in some ways even more important than demonstrating, and in some ways even more, well, not as important as voting, perhaps even more important than other types of political involvement next year, is involving yourself in an organization that advocates on behalf of an issue or issues that you don't believe are being satisfactorily addressed. So regardless of whether your issue is immigration or environmental protection, whether it's abortion rights, whatever the issue happens to be, there are organizations that do not come and go with the elections the way candidates do, but getting involved in one or more of those organizations and helping strengthening the, if you will, the civic infrastructure of society, to me is the best way, the single best way to make a difference. Because those organizations continue to exist, regardless of whether it's an election or not. They also attract people from a variety of different backgrounds and sometimes even political persuasions. And in an election season, they become the most credible messengers to undecided voters, much more than the Republican or Democratic national committees would. So I'd say organizations that advocate for an issue or issues that are important to you. As a volunteer, if you feel up to going to the office, that's the most productive thing. But if not, even phone and digital involvement, to me, is the best way, certainly in an odd-numbered year, not necessarily to make change, but to lay the groundwork for making that change.
Do you feel comfortable in naming some of the organizations?
Sure. Depending on the issue, Planned Parenthood. Depending on the issue, Beit Tzedek, the legal aid organization, or MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Foundation, or CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane and Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, the Sierra Club. Google and ChatGPT can probably do this better and faster and more comprehensively than I can. But my point is they're there. They've always been there. They all need donations, and even more than donations, they need volunteers. And whether it leads to political change or not, either way, you're making a difference in a real person's life, even before the election season kicks into gear.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. And then I see Randy's hand up next.
Hi, Dan. I had two questions about two different subjects. One is, considering the polarization, do you think across the country, do you think protests in cities all across the country that are growing and will probably grow, especially over this weekend with the parade, will have any impact? And the second question, totally different, is do you think that when the bill that is being considered the beautiful bill somehow gets through, do you think that Trump will have over time less emphasis on cutting budget items, and that this was just really a lead up for that bill?
Two good questions. And Randy, am I correct that you are visiting Superman in his Fortress of Solitude? Is that what's going on behind you?
Oh, that's a background picture from Greenland that I took.
Okay, I thought the new movie's about to come out and Randy's getting ahead of the rest of us. I should have assumed as much. Two great questions. I do believe that both the parade and the counter protests, I'll do this the other way, neither will change many minds. Again, I think this is the premise of your question. If you believe on Friday that a military parade across Washington is a good idea, you'll believe it even more strongly on Sunday. And if you think it's a bad idea, your feelings will similarly intensify over 48 hours. That said, I don't think counter protests from either party of any ideology are futile. I think it's an important way of reminding other people who share your opinion that they're not as alone and isolated as they feel they are. And I would give that advice to progressives and conservatives, that being visible offers reassurance to those who share your beliefs. On the budget bill, whether it's big or beautiful, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. But on the budget bill, I think you might be onto something here. The tensions we're seeing between the House and Senate Republicans are not going away. If anything, they're getting even more intense. The Senate's made it clear that they want to lower the cap for the state and local tax exemption. And there's House Republicans from blue states who are furious about that. We're seeing very dramatic differences of opinion on how the energy subsidies from Biden's big, beautiful bill should be implemented or maintained or not. And Trump has never suggested, except in passing, that deficit reduction is a particularly high priority of his. Now, he is beginning to hear from the markets and the people who run them that the level of national debt is reaching a level that could have a real downward effect on the economy and particularly on the markets. And that is something he pays attention to. But on balance, here's a man who in the private sector proclaimed himself as the king of debt. So to me, one of the most puzzling things about Elon Musk, and I should say I have an extensive list of puzzling things about Elon Musk, but one of the most significant to me was his belief that Trump would buy into aggressive reduction in the size of government. Because that just isn't something that Trump has ever prioritized previously. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the way that the White House reconciled the differences between the House and the Senate is to give them both what they want, even if it meant a higher deficit. The other alternative is for him to put an even tighter squeeze on those, resistant members. The two aren't mutually exclusive, but while I never predict anything that Donald Trump will say or do, I think your instinct on deficit expansion rather than reduction, you might be onto something there. And I'd encourage everyone in this conversation to keep an eye on it, because I think Randy's instinct on this might be prescient.
Thank you, Dan. Just before I go over to Tim, the other Tim pointed out that I did miss Donald's question in the chat. And Donald, do you want to come unmuted and read it, or I can if you want?
You can go ahead.
Okay. All right. So Donald's question is, the DNC seems to be a complete mess. Hogg just announced that he won't run for re-election as vice chair. Is the Democratic Party so fractured that it might implode in 2026 when it should easily be able to retake the House?
Okay. So I promise you that I'm not saying this from a partisan basis at all, Donald, but the DNC seems to be a complete mess for one very appropriate reason. It is a complete mess. And that doesn't necessarily suggest that the issues for which it advocates are better or worse than the other side, but just operationally, which I think is the basis of your question, and it's a smart one, is what's going on over there. And I would say that any political party after a presidential election goes through recriminations and internal divisions. I mentioned in the webinar itself how the Republicans, after 2012, appointed a autopsy committee, their word, not mine, that among other things recommended a more accommodating approach on immigration policy in order to attract more Asian Pacific and Latino voters. So when a party loses, this is what it goes through. But I do feel like the Democratic Party is struggling with a especially pronounced struggle in this regard. David Hogg, the 25-year-old Parkland High School survivor who became elected Democratic National Committee vice chair early this year, I think, as many of you know, has created a great deal of controversy because even while serving as DNC vice chair, he was also heading an organization that was backing Democratic challengers to older Democratic incumbent office holders. And the basic argument that he heard from DNC leadership is both are legitimate goals, but you can't do both at the same time. If you're going to be a party office holder, you can't be advocating for the removal of party incumbents. And so just a small clarification, Hogg was not up for re-election. Rather, he and another vice chair who was elected earlier this year, it turns out were elected because of a violation of party rules that have nothing to do with Hogg's incumbent challenging program. There are a certain number of seats set aside for both genders in the DNC leadership. And somehow or other that managed to be overlooked earlier this year. The other man who was elected has decided to run again to keep his position. Hogg decided, my guess is under extraordinary pressure, just to step aside and concentrate his efforts on the incumbency challenge program. In the grand scheme of things, there isn't a voter in America, except for Mr. or Mrs. Hogg, who are going to vote based on all this. But if I understand the premise of your question, and if I do, it's a smart one, are these internal operational snafus indicative of a larger problem? And the answer is they are. I don't know if they will prevent the Democrats from retaining the House of Representatives, regaining control of the House of Representatives this fall or next fall. If it does, it would be historic, because it's almost a historic inevitability that the minority party does retain the majority in a president's midterm elections. The last time that didn't happen was 2002, when George W. Bush at that point was still being judged as a great success for his prosecution of the Iraq War. So if Democrats do not regain control of the House next fall, it would be considered a surprise of epic and historical protections. That said, I believe the Democratic Congressional Committee and the Democratic leadership, and similarly the Democratic Senatorial Committee and Senate leadership, have more of a hands-on role in these fights than the DNC does. So while this does reflect some disarray in the Democratic Party, it does not necessarily mean you should presume operational problems during the midterm elections next year. So the Democratic Party is going to have to figure out what it stands for. Historically, when a losing party figures out what it stands for is when they pick their nominee in the next presidential election. So we won't really know what the Democratic Party stands for, and they won't really know what the Democratic Party stands for until the conclusion of the primary process in 2028, which, if nothing else, underscores for me what a bad mistake it was from their standpoint not to have even an abbreviated competitive primary process in 2024 after Biden stepped down. In the absence of that competition, it's impossible for a party to know what it stands for. And again, it's easy to do this with 2020, with 2020 hindsight. But I think it does underscore what a mistake that was. I don't make predictions, but like I said, it would be a huge upset if Democrats didn't win back the House. And I would say that their chances of winning back the Senate, while small, given the number of seats that they have to defend, are probably better now than they were 60 days ago. So there's a lot more time between now and next November, but I would say I've actually seen more positive movement on that front than negative, David Hogg stuff notwithstanding.
Thank you so much. All right, Tim, if you want to take it over.
Oh, not take it over, just ask it. Actually, Dan, it is such a pleasure seeing you again, my friend. Let me just make a few quick comments before I ask the question I have. First of all, I've got to give you kudos. Dan Schnur won me 0 on the Kilmar Brago outcome. I thought he was toast. Apparently he's back this way, and we'll see just how long that lasts. And unfortunately, I'm going back and forth. I'm literally on another session with one of the Los Angeles organizations, Latino, and I'm listening to you and I'm reading the comments here with family members that had AR-15s pointed at them downtown. There's people here that are asking, what can you get involved in? You can get involved in the organizations that you point out, but you gotta stop sipping wine and get a beer. You got to come and get involved with some of the organizations that literally are feet on the ground, that actually have skin in the game. That takes me to the comment about the rare earths. What is it? Trump mentioned shithole countries. Damn straight shithole countries with a lot of shithole rare earths that everybody now seems to want. China realized it. China got in, and China also learned a lot from the United States. It's called racism. China treats the people in these countries like the U.S. did during the Jim Crow areas. The last thing about China is I believe that China has a very long memory. Russia should be scared. Like in the Addams family, be afraid, be very afraid. China will basically take from Russia when it's that time. They've already changed the map that's already encroached upon Russian territory. China does not play games. They got a long memory, and they will ultimately come to fruition, whatever their plans are. And the question I had is, do you think that if Ruth Bader Ginsburg had retired, we would have a totally different world order at this point in time? Thanks for your patience.
Boy, if we weren't already 7 minutes over, Tim, I would want to respond to every single one of the points that you made. But instead, I'll just answer your question. And the answer is no. I don't think the world would be fundamentally different right now. There are 6 members of the U.S. Supreme Court who were appointed by Republican presidents, and 3 who were nominated, by Democrats. And while a 5-4 Roberts majority would have a much different dynamic to it, I don't know that it'd be a fundamentally different dynamic. So in retrospect, I know many people, particularly Democrats, but not only, would have liked to have seen Justice Ginsburg retire so she could have been replaced with a nominee by the Democratic president. But of course, there's no guarantee that that nominee would have been confirmed in a Republican Senate. But even if they were, while a 5-4 majority versus a 6-3 one creates some different outcomes, I don't know if they're as fundamentally different as they would be on a tightly balanced court. Okay, so I know we're over, but I will do my best to quickly answer Jim and Jim, and then we'll call it a night. What do you think, everybody? So we'll do it alphabetically. Jim Clark and Jim Grant. Does that sound okay, Maddie?
Sounds good to me.
Sure, your name starts with A. You love alphabetical things.
In reverse order of intelligence, but thank you. My question is very quick, and it's a corollary to one you answered earlier, but I think it's a more particularized version of that. And that is, what can we do about what I think is one of the most disturbing trends of this administration, and that's RFK Jr. His dismissal yesterday of the 17 physician experts on the vaccine board is appalling. I spoke to my brother yesterday. He's one of the seniors, a world-renowned gastroenterologist and a senior guy at Mayo Clinic. His physician community, and he's very plugged. He was a former president of the American Council on Gastroenterologists, has like 15,000 of them. People are appalled in that community. I'm not a doctor, but I mean, what the things that Kennedy has done, in defiance, by the way, of his prior Senate testimony, is appalling and scary as hell. Any additional thoughts on what people can do? Because I used to be president of the Bedzedic board, and joining that board ain't going to help you get rid of RFK Jr.
No, it's not. And I should clarify what I was mentioning earlier about joining civic organizations. The direct impact of those organizations on cabinet nominations is pretty removed. But I think a lot more people in our communities pay attention to the issues on which these organizations work than they pay attention to partisan politics. And so I think if you want to change the makeup of the electorate, doing it through organizations that concentrate, as Tim correctly suggested, at the community level on issues that are important to voters, more important to non-voters, is going to be important to ultimately put a majority in Congress that agrees with your decision rather than disagrees. Now, with Kennedy, I don't think the majority of Congress agrees with him. In fact, there's a number of Republicans who are very skeptical, most notably Senator Cassidy, the current chair of the Senate Health Committee, who are very, very skeptical on Kennedy. They voted for him out of allegiance to Trump. But that tells me that should Democrats regain control of either the House or the Senate next year, the oversight process will not be a purely partisan one. I suspect if you see a Democratic majority pushing back at Kennedy, for example, you will see Republicans joining them in that pushback. So the answer to everything isn't a changed majority in Congress, just like the answer to everything isn't larger civic organizations. But on this one, I think a Democratic majority in either Chamber of Commerce, Congress, excuse me, would have a much broader impact on Kennedy, in either on his behavior or on his survival. Jim Grant.
And thank you. And Jim, I completely concur. Thank you for asking that question, everyone before. I'm going to take it in a different direction because I think we've certainly discussed what's going on. But I'm beginning to think post-Trump, right now more a prayer than reality. The damage he has done to our nation is incalculable in our Constitution. But I'm looking overseas and thinking about our allies and alliances. And so my question to you, Dan, is regardless of who is president in future, how can our allies ever trust us again?
Well, and this goes back to something I was talking about earlier, Jim. To me, the biggest difference between 2016 and 2024 is the US's historical allies don't see Trump's election last year as an aberration. Rather, I think they accurately see it as a reflection of the sentiment of a large portion of the American populace. Don't get me wrong, who's president is incredibly important. But, and Trump certainly carries out a more isolationist nationalist agenda more aggressively than most possible alternatives or successors. But we have a country now in which the majority of our fellow Americans, as was the case after both world wars, after Korea and after Vietnam and after Iraq, are looking inward. We have a majority in our country right now that, just like after every major economic downturn for the last century plus, are looking inward. And when the American people decide that they'd like to put the rest of the world on hold for a while, they tend to elect presidents of either party who reflect that opinion. Of course, Trump is more aggressive about this than Biden was, but Biden, as I said earlier, took a markedly different approach on international engagement than Obama or Clinton or Carter. And so part of the question is who gets elected next November and in November of 2028. But again, this is where I come back to civic and community and organizational involvement. This is what de Tocqueville pointed out is what makes us uniquely American. The way we revel in these community gatherings is, as long as the majority of this country believes that we can and should isolate ourselves from the rest of the world, then our historic allies will continue to be nervous about whether they can count us in the future, regardless of whether a D or an R is president. Briefly, I disagree with Tim, as I do occasionally, but only occasionally. These things move in cycles. This isn't the only time the US has gone through an isolationist period. We have before, and the international community came to distrust us. And then extraordinary events caused us to re-engage. And while that distrust, as you correctly pointed out, Tim, didn't disappear, it dissipated because we had returned. Henry Kissinger argued many, many years ago that when the US does withdraw from the world stage, bad actors take its place. And at a certain point, lack of trust notwithstanding, when the US does decide to re-engage to confront those bad actors, those distrustful allies come back. And that sounded much more smug than I intended it to. I intended to sound much more worried than I did. But I guess the main point I'm trying to make, Jim, because it's a smart point that both you and Jim Clark made, is that politics doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's a reflection of society. It's often an exaggeration of society. And the trends that you're talking about don't emanate from Washington. It's where they end up.
Thank you.
On a much happier note, it's great to see all of you again.
Yeah.
And
Happy
believe it or
Father's
not,
Day.
maybe we can talk about this in July if you remind me, Maddie. Let's set aside a little time, not in the webinar, but in this, to talk about why we should, in spite of everything we've just talked about for the last 45 minutes, why we should still be optimistic. So let's save a little bit of time for that, because I still am.
I'll write it down.
All right. We'll see y'all next month.
Thank you.